This week, the Somali fraud scandal is still dominating headlines. President Donald Trump has offered his color commentary, setting liberals into an apoplectic fit, and having Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey actually speaking Somali. We're going to talk about the Somali fraud, where it comes from, why it's important, and what it says about America's immigration crisis. We're also going to talk about the campaign to oust Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela and the New York Times attempt to kneecap the venture capitalist David Sachs. All that and more on this week's episode of Rufo and Lomez. This week, the Somali fraud story that we've been talking about for the last few weeks is, to my great surprise, still dominating the headlines. And oftentimes when you're talking about the news, you go week by week by week. There's a main theme. The story pops up and it drops out within 48 hours, 72 hours, sometimes a little bit longer than that. But then there are other stories that, for complex number of reasons we can talk about as we get through the show this week, stories have a trajectory where they hit orbit and then they are spinning and gaining power for weeks, and in some cases more than a month. And this is one of those stories. And so for me, it's been kind of amazing. Like, I watched the mechanics of the reporting come together. We launched it. And now it's really taken on a life of its own. Lomez, what are you thinking? What are the accelerants to this process? What have you thought about and noticed this week?
Yeah, I mean, this story raises all sorts of meta stories, one of which is how a piece of journalism like this, how an expose on something that's happening, which, a lot of people kind of knew about. There was a lot of local reporting about it. There were some stories here and there about it. And my question to you is, okay, because this is something that you've been successful at your entire career as a political activist and journalist, is you talk about a story taking on a life of its own, but I have to imagine that you have maybe a little bit more insight on it than that. What is the particular quality, this sort of magic something that certain stories have that allow it not only to enter mainstream consciousness and dominate a news cycle or two, but also then translate into political action, which is what we're seeing here. So for those who are just sort of casually keeping an eye on this story, one interesting thing that's happened is that after your story broke about the Somali fraud rings in Minnesota, there have been a few notable changes in immigration policy, or if not changes, there have been some direct action in response to this. One of which is ICE is now targeting some of these communities in Minneapolis where they suspect there are a lot of illegals. The other thing is Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, has seemed to take very seriously some of the accusations you guys put forward in the City Journal piece about this money from this fraud ring being used to finance these terrorist organizations, Al-Shabaab in particular in Minnesota, and then using the power of the Treasury Department, perhaps through FinCEN or other ways that they can get into bank accounts and track money and see where it goes and figure out who's responsible and who's getting kickbacks, perhaps someone like Keith Ellison, by the way, which is a very interesting sort of piece of this. So, okay, my question to you is, I want to bounce it back to you. I don't really know how this works. I just, I wake up in the morning, I look at Twitter, and there's the story again. I suspect that you actually have some expectation when a story like this comes out that it will have lasting power. And so what do you think it is about this story that has given it this life cycle?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something I've thought about a lot. And at first I was able to do this a number of times, almost just instinctively, intuitively. Writing stories, they catch, you figure out how the media cycle is working, you fight it out where there's a debate, and then you try to deliver it upwards towards people in a position of political authority to take action. to change a policy, to bring it into a legislative proposal or what have you. But I think after having done it a number of times and now studied it and tried to kind of diagnose, like, how do these things spread, a couple of things are really important. The first of which is you have to figure out where there is a gap or a lack of connectivity between a subterranean public energy and a lack of intellectual or empirical framing. And so, during the George Floyd moment, there was this huge anxiety and unease, especially among center-right or conservative people about what was happening, this kind of racialist ideology. And so, but they didn't have a language to talk about it with. They didn't have a conceptual frame. They didn't have a vocabulary. And so critical race theory was the one. And on this particular question, it's the same phenomenon where I think everyone knows after COVID that the government is flooding the system with cash and that we have no idea where this cash is going. Right. Simultaneously, we let in millions of people into the country. We don't know who many of these people are. And they are here in many cases, not in all cases, of course, to exploit this vulnerability in our system and to take cash out of the flow of the government system and send it back home to buy luxury properties overseas, right, whatever. But the other reasons in this particular case, as you said, there were elements of this story that had been floating around for a long time, but nobody brought it into one place. Nobody gave it a kind of a summary, and then it always has to have the killer detail. And that's what I've learned. You can make a great piece, a great argument, great reporting, but it has to have that one killer detail that just hooks the interest of the media and therefore the public. And in this case, it was the Al-Shabaab connection. Right. That was the original reporting that we did. That was the additional kind of exclusive reporting that we did. And that just makes what could be like a mundane Medicaid fraud or Medicare fraud down in Florida. I mean, it'll hit local headlines. It's a scandal. But you have this immigration angle where there's this huge energy, and then you have that detail that hooks the interest. And then once it spins out into the media system, you're really just guiding it. You've lost control. And then really, and I want to hear your take on this, when President Trump takes it upon himself to start spouting off on it, then it goes absolutely wild.
I don't want him in our country, I'll be honest with you, okay? Somebody would say, oh, that's not politically correct. I don't care. I don't want him in our country. Their country's no good for a reason. Their country stinks. Our country's at a tipping point. We could go bad. We're at a tipping point. I don't know if people mind me saying that, but I'm saying it. We could go one way or the other, and we're going to go the wrong way if we keep taking in garbage into our country. Ilhan Omar is garbage. She's garbage. Her friends are garbage. These aren't people that work. These aren't people that say, let's go, come on, let's make this place great. These are people that do nothing but complain. They complain. And from where they came from, they got nothing. They came from paradise, and they said, this isn't paradise. But when they come from hell, and they complain and do nothing but we don't want them in our country. Let them go back to where they came from and fix it.
I enjoyed that. What did you think about Trump's rhetoric? Did he go too far? Was it right on point?
It's Trump, okay? Like, this is how Trump talks. This is classic Trump. This is Trump speaking like your grandpa talking to the TV. My grandfather would sit around and watch like the O'Reilly Factor, okay? And he would yell at the TV, and he would speak in a certain phraseology that was like exaggerated in a certain way and was, I don't know if vulgar is quite the right word, but perhaps imprecise. It was impolitic, we might say. But it was, of course, true. He was articulating something that was felt by a vast majority of people, and certainly and in Trump's case, by the vast majority of his supporters. And I think actually where this dovetails with your argument about why this case took off or this story took off, my hunch is that this story about a Somali fraud ring in Minnesota in which they're stealing all of this money related to funding that this sort of giant federal slush fund that came out of COVID remediation. And this is a kind of perfect embodiment or microcosm of the larger immigration picture that has set off a lot of Americans, because what we're told, the story we're told, the kind of fantasy we're told about immigration is these people come here, they are seeking a better life, they just want to live out the American dream, they want to become Americans in some important and essential sense. And given the sort of resources and space and opportunity to do that, they are going to, and they are going to benefit us as a country. They are going to provide far more than they take. And they're going to be a net positive when we look at both economic metrics and even social metrics. And while that's a nice story, and I think something that we'd all like to believe, and is true in certain cases, certainly, as a general matter, just a kind of observation of the landscape of American life by most people reflects that this is not actually what's happening. The people who have come here, particularly over the last 4 years, this massive flood of immigration that has come to America in the last 4 years, but over the last decade in particular, is one, coming from places that don't have that same aspiration to assimilate into being an American in the same way that we would hope, that they are here to take advantage of us and skim off the public coffers and take advantage of the sort of kindness and generosity of spirit of the American people, that they retain a kind of anti-American clannishness that is completely anathema to what it means to be American. And there's this great sort of disjunction between that vision of what we hope these immigrant populations might be versus what they actually are. And I think this story helps demonstrate that. It's a kind of articulation and illustration of this problem. And so, again, like, maybe part of the answer to the question I asked you, which is why do some of these stories take off, is because, like you said, there's a kind of psychological priming that's already there. People know in some intuitive sense that something not quite right is happening. They just need this story, this narrative, and this is the importance of narrative, of course, as much as it is, investigative, tightly researched journalism. It's a story that illustrates that intuition and brings it to life in a way that now they can positively react to. In other words, they can do something now with this uneasy feeling that they've had.
Lomez, this is the season of colds and flus. I know I'm feeling it this week. You're feeling it this week. What is your go-to home remedy?
Honestly, I drink tea when I get sick, and I've been sick all week, and I've been drinking my KINDRED Harvest tea. I've been focused on their immunity blend, which is amazing. I've been drinking some of the Moroccan mint. They also have a, sleep inducement tea with some chamomile and some other, fragrant herbs. It's been great. Love it. And truthfully, it's made me feel a lot better.
Yeah, it's a great tea. It's designed and packaged beautifully. The bags are not going to send microplastics into your system. It's a great company with aligned values. And if you are feeling that a tickle in your throat, you're feeling maybe a fever coming on, or if you just want to get into the holiday season and relax as it gets darker earlier, I highly recommend that you go over to kindredharvest.co and put in the promo code Rufo for 20% off. That's kindredharvest.co. Fantastic premium quality teas, and the discount code Rufo. Take 20% off. Yeah, that's right. And I think that's what sets apart some of the great stories from some of the stories that don't catch or end up being kind of minor stories or filler stories. You're giving people something concrete to latch onto. And there's a huge mistake in political circles, particularly intellectual circles, where people believe that politics works on abstract argumentation, or logical syllogisms, or kind of Aristotelian speculations.
Right.
And look, I like that stuff as much as the next guy. I have kind of a side hobby, reading as much of that as I can. But what those people often miss is that very few people actually think in those terms. Very few people can look at a problem abstractly and come to reasonable conclusions that matches their intuition. Whereas the narrative effect of breaking a story like this Somali fraud story gives everyone the ability to formulate their opinion and then use that story as a launching point for their political remedy, for their political demand, for their political desire. And so people see this and they say, hey, wait a minute, this is a fundamental violation of my sense of justice.
Yeah.
This illustrates the fundamental incompatibility of our political system and our immigration system.
Right.
You can't have a Scandinavian-style welfare state in Minnesota and also import a population from a culture where, again, this is documented, where they have a clannish, kin-based system, and it's actually not seen as bad. It's seen in many ways as good to exploit a centralized government or centralized state.
Yeah.
That is a fundamental incompatibility, and this nice kind of liberal narrative, which is the placard on the Statue of Liberty, give us your poor, you're tired, you're hungry, you're whatnot. Again, yes, but you also have to verify if that's what's actually happening. And the Somali fraud story tells people in a clear way, hey, this is a violation of that myth, and therefore we need to take alternate actions and remedies. And the other thing that is really important, and you ask, why do stories pop? One thing I've learned is that you have to connect it to politics. You have to connect the narrative to power. That, I'm just writing a story, you get it out there. I don't have any fundamental political authority or power. But you can connect it with people who have the ability to do so. And so actually connecting it with the president of the United States is a great way to do it, because if the president, takes up something, it's going to drive national headlines for a long time. That's any president. Trump has a particular gift for, driving headlines, but that's true with any president. And so I think the question now, and the uncomfortable question for liberals, and especially Minnesota liberals, is what do you do about it? Yeah. And let's look at the reaction. Let's roll the clip from Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey in the wake of this scandal. Let's see what he has to say about it, and let's hear his clear condemnation of fraud in his community.
To our Somali community, we love you and we stand with you. Our police, many of whom are Somali themselves, are trusted partners in keeping people safe. They will not collaborate with any federal agency around doing immigration enforcement work. Our city staff and our law enforcement will not ask the question as to whether an individual is documented or not. That's not American. That's not what we are about. And we're going to do right by every single person in our cities. And so, to our Somali community, Daman Shabka, Somalied Kunul, Minnesota, Garahan, Minneapolis, Waan, Kuji Janila Hai, Waan, Ku Gereb Taganahan. We love you.
Beautiful.
We stand with you, and we aren't backing down.
Yeah, I mean, Garaba Takanaha. That really sums it up. Garaba
Chris,
Takanaha.
Stop speaking Italian on the podcast. Okay. Look.
I want to set it up for you, because you had a great point. You said the liberal myth is that these groups come and become American. Yeah. But in this case, it's precise opposite. These groups come and the Americans become Somalian. Yeah. And so walk us through how we should think about this.
Okay, on the one hand, I'll just acknowledge that, yes, it's like not uncommon for politicians to speak in the native languages of certain constituencies. I find this particular example sort of funny for reasons that I don't think I have to explain. I think most people just find kind of like absurd on its face. I want to say there's like 5 things I want to say here. So firstly, let me say that there is a beautiful kind of synchronicity, and this is a testament to the persistence of certain cultural, ethnic norms to obtain over time and in any place you might find them, that the Nordic populations of the upper Midwest are engaged in the exact same sort of altruistic migration experiment that I think is doomed to failure, that their, kinfolk are engaged in still in their Scandinavian countries. So I find this like sort of beautiful in a way. It is consistent with my assertion here that you can't just like strip people of the habits and norms of the groups that they come from. And so I will pause on this point for now. I want to come back to it and ask you why it's significant that we say that this is a Somali phenomenon. I know you've been pressed on this. Like, people are asking, well, why can't you just call this fraud? Like, why do you have to insist on calling this Somali fraud? So I want to get your answer to that. That's one point. I just want to point out that synchronicity. The other thing here is with like Jacob Frey or the liberal establishment in a place like Minneapolis and the country at large is they're not going to do anything. I don't think that it's politically wise to expect them and operate under the assumption that things are going to get so bad and they're going to be so pressed by their voter base that they have to like do something about this. I think this issue of immigration and their insistence on a kind of fantastical notion of flattened equality across all groups, all people, that we can't make any judgments about who we bring in, and maybe this group is in fact responsible for a higher proportion of certain sort of behavior than this other group, and perhaps that should be taken into account when we make decisions at a population scale, which of course immigration is. They're not going to do any of this, I don't think. I think their fundamental sort of ideology denies them the possibility of taking these kinds of questions into account. And just as they did with like Black Lives Matter or the trans craze, they're just going to dig their heels in until they start losing the elections and are just pushed out of power. So a guy like Jacob Frey or Tim Walz simply just has to lose an election. The people of Minnesota are at some point going to just have to say, we're not going to do this anymore. We don't want this anymore. Will they get to that point? I certainly hope so. But, you and I came from California. It isn't the case. It doesn't follow from things being very bad that you will necessarily see some kind of political turn that can reverse the fortunes of the place you're in. Things can go from bad to worse and just spiral and spiral and spiral indefinitely. So will this get fixed? I hope so. How it'll get fixed, the people of Minnesota are going to have to make a choice about what kind of life they want to live and what kind of state they want to live in.
But of course, we already have a recent example that provides evidence that things are likely to go from bad to worse. Again, these stories had been circulating in local media in bits and pieces around the state of Minnesota for many years. And Minneapolis voters recently reelected Jacob Frey to the office of mayor. And let's say they said, well, Frey is complicit. He's let this go too far. He didn't do anything to stop the fraud. He's, he doesn't seem to be serving the interests of Minnesota or Minneapolis voters as a whole. Let's elect the next guy. Well, the next guy, the man whom he narrowly beat in this election, was, of course, Omar Fateh, Somali, hyper leftist.
It needs
who had
to
a
be
personal.
Said. I have to pause right here. It needs to be said. Omar Fateh, and this was a story back during the election cycle, was cheating, was committing fraud during the election to rig the Democratic primary in his favor. Yes. And it was so brazen, in fact, again, this level of fraud that is so pervasive. It was so brazen that even Will Stancil, Mr. Will Stancil had to step in and say, this is even a little too much for me. And the Democratic Party had to rescind
they had to annul it.
Yeah, their vote for Omar Fateh and sort of declare like an open election because of the nature of this fraud. Okay, sorry to intervene, but
no. It actually it's even more complicated, and the story is even worse for Fateh. I think it's Omar Fateh. So Fateh it cheats his way into kind of a backroom, smoke-filled room nominating process for this like weird, idiosyncratic Minnesota like Democratic sub-party, and then they pull it back in some kind of embarrassment. I mean, they had to do it because it was so clear that he had rigged this thing. But then they kind of like they take the gloves off and they say, well, we're not going to hit him about this because that makes us feel too uncomfortable as white liberals in good standing.
Right.
But then, what's even worse is that Fateh himself had long-standing relationships with a number of the people who were arrested and then convicted of these fraud schemes.
Shocking.
And so the fraudsters were not, the downtrodden, the exiled, the marginalized, bad apples at the outer ring of Somali society, and that they were shunned as they were discovered for fraud. No. These people were tightly knit with Ilhan Omar, with Omar Fateh, with Attorney General Keith Ellison. And so you have the irony that actually Jacob Fateh or Jacob Frey, I mean, Jacob it's like they're like merged. I mean, they're like hybrids now. But Jacob Frey is the least bad option. And we know certainly that he's not going to do anything to solve the problem. And so what you're going to have is this static situation where the reality is unfolding, but political leaders engage in these elaborate rituals of reality suppression.
Yeah.
So we need to do whatever we can to suppress the basic reality of what's happening. And the pain of what's happening is not as bad as the potential pain of acknowledging what's happening.
Yeah.
And the real tragedy here, though, is that situation can actually sustain for a very long time.
Yeah. And I think, what they're going to do as well, and what I've already seen them do, is just call you or anyone else who points this out a racist. And that mere accusation then sort of trumps whatever bad deed was done by the people in question. And the focus then from the liberal establishment can just be that, well, the people making these accusations are racist, therefore the accusations are void. We can just ignore them. And or there's like a worse evil out there, and that worse evil are the people pointing out the fact that this happened. And so I want to give you the opportunity to just answer the question. I have my own answer to this question, but okay, people are going to say, well, Chris, why do you have to point out that they're Somali? Why does that matter? Why is that a descriptive fact about this situation that has any bearing on policy, on how we remedy the situation? Are you just being xenophobic? Are you just expressing a kind of vulgar hatred towards this outgroup as a way to rally, your base and make these horrible accusations so that you can increase, your political salience? Aren't you the bad guy for calling them Somali, Chris?
Aren't you the bad guy for exposing that some people were defrauding the government to the tune of billions of dollars? But and it boils down to this. The fundamental criticism is that saying Somali fraud ring is in itself a racist expression.
Right.
We saw this from a fellow named Zaid Jilani.
Right.
I think it's kind of an Ibram Kendi style critique by saying Somali fraud ring. You're highlighting the fact that a minority population, you're conflating everyone with some. You're making an association between this population and criminality. But it's the fundamental problem is actually before you get there. So you have this phenomenon that exists. It's a reality. These people stole this money in this state. Okay, these are facts. The question is not racist or not racist. The question is true or not true. And so my fundamental interest is to say, is this true or not true? We've demonstrated that, of course, that it's true. And then you're truthful about who is doing this. And so there are dozens of these fraud schemes. They're stealing billions of dollars, and they're all traceable to a small population, which is disproportionately involved in these fraudulent enterprises. Yep. And so I think it's totally legitimate. And actually, it's essential. You have to do so, because if you want to solve the problem, ultimately, you're going to need to get the buy-in of the Somali community itself. And so it's not racist in the same way it's not racist to say the Italian mafia, a Cambodian gang, the Ukrainian auto theft ring, whatever it might be. Ethnic or clan-based criminal enterprises are not limited to racial minorities or African or Asian or Latin populations. These are common features all over the world, in every continent, amongst every large racial demographic. And it matters because the way you solve kind of ethnic-based mafia or criminal enterprise involves understanding the culture of those groups, trying to highlight good leadership in those groups, and ultimately, like Rudy Giuliani with the Italian mafia, taking the upstanding members of those groups and saying, we have to set a standard. If you want to be part of American society, you have to leave those attributes and cultures and enterprises behind. Yep. And so I think that you actually have to say so. And the fact that it is, I think it's just uncomfortable for people. It's uncomfortable to say, a group from East Africa is committing extraordinary, the largest systematic fraud scheme in Minnesota history, certainly. Yep. It's just so uncomfortable, but we need to actually break through that discomfort and just ask, is it true or not? And then how are we going to deal with this? What do we actually need to know about this in order to solve the problem?
Yeah, I think, again, this is something we've talked about at some length on our last episode, talking about immigration generally. You have to just face this reality that when we're talking about policy decisions at the scale of populations, which immigration is, and I just want to reiterate this point because there are people who will deny this. People who are, pro-immigration will say, no, these are all individual decisions we're making about individuals. And certain individuals come here, groups don't come here. That's just simply not true. Something like 15% of immigration is determined by individual merit. Over 50% of migration is what's called chain migration. You are literally bringing in families, kin groups. Okay, you're bringing in population level peoples, and you're also bringing in then population scale behaviors and norms. And it's perfectly legitimate, in fact, necessary. It is absolutely essential if we are to have sound and prudent immigration policy that redounds to the benefit of Americans, okay? The people who are here, not the people who might want to come here. Okay, not future Americans, but Americans now. We have to have an understanding of group level behaviors and norms. And so, okay, yes, the Somali population, and I pointed this out on a previous episode, Somalia is the second most corrupt country in the world. That is not just happenstance. That is a norm of a particular group. Likewise, Somalis are notorious for FGM, female genital mutilation, extremely high rates of female genital mutilation, okay? Now, we have to ask ourselves, is that the kind of norm and behavior we want to import to the country? Is it to the benefit of Americans to take in masses of people who inhabit those norms and behaviors, okay? Now, we can have an argument about this. I will just say, for now, that it is perfectly legitimate to ask those questions. And so being honest about where these people are coming from is perfectly legitimate from a policy perspective.
Yeah, of course that's true. And I think there's this illusion that America's immigration system is oriented towards skimming the kind of cream of the crop, the most talented, the most educated, the most entrepreneurial, the most wealthy people around the world. That's just not our immigration system.
No.
And we should have a debate about whether that should be our immigration system. And I think, there's a good argument to be made that would be at the very minimum better than what we have now. And so if you were to say, we're going to bring Somali PhDs, Somali doctors, Somali, biochemical engineers, like, okay, I guess, fine. That'd be certainly better than just like a mass chain migration. But the dirty secret there is that there's just aren't very many Somali PhDs, biochemical engineers, et cetera. And so you would be essentially eliminating them from the potential pool of immigrants. And again, that's fine. America doesn't have to accept people from anywhere around the world. We have no obligation to permit entry to any population for any reason at all. And so it's really a question we should be asking. And I hope that this debate on Somali fraud helps us get there to say, hey, wait a minute, what are the criteria that we are using to filter, 7 or 8 billion people around the world, which again, you can't judge as individuals. The American government is not big enough, sophisticated enough, it's just logistically impossible to make individual judgments on everyone around the world. But you have to make some prudent calculations, and then you have to have some prudent filters. And again, like the H-1B debate we've talked about, there's other debates about, foreign graduate students. Should they have a green card stamped onto their PhDs? I mean, there's good debates to be had, but we're not even close to that. Like, if that was the only debate that we were having, we would be in pretty good shape. But what we have is a system that is actually even worse. It's, you have this undifferentiated system of mass immigration, and then you have mass illegal immigration on top of that. So let's shift gears and let's talk about another story that is related to migration, related to international affairs, related to foreign policy, and that's the story of the Venezuelan drug boats that have been, blown up by airstrikes directed by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. Give us the basic story for those who haven't heard about this. Like, what's happening here, and why should we care?
Okay, so this is an interesting story, and it's going to raise a lot of questions about our foreign policy, a kind of new era of foreign policy, especially it applies to South America. I'm curious to get your takes on this, but there's two different things happening in tandem here that are related, but are kind of separated in the media, but of course go together. So the first is the United States military, Department of War under Pete Hegseth, has been bombing these narco boats leaving from Venezuela and trafficking drugs to America. That's the story we're being told.
Cocaine in particular, right?
Cocaine in particular, yeah. I think there's some confusion. People are saying that it's fentanyl. It's probably not, actually. Most of the fentanyl is coming in from Mexico.
China.
And even then, I mean, I just, for the sake of just being completely candid about, what I've read on this topic, most of the cocaine comes up through the Pacific. These boats are headed out into the Caribbean somewhere. Maybe they're going to Europe. It's like a little unclear, if I'm being totally honest, like
correct
where these boats are intended to dock and who's responsible for this. Is Maduro responsible? Okay, but the line here is that there are these boats that we've determined are certainly trafficking drugs. We have declared this a sort of terrorist act because these drugs, as everybody knows, are killing lots of people. And it really is a hazard to our country. And we've been striking these boats in a similar manner. It reminds me of the signature strikes that the Obama administration was doing, where they would sort of determine the movements of certain people and their associations with certain known terrorists. And even without ever knowing the names or identities of people, we're just drone striking people. They came under some flack from, civil libertarians and such. But this has been a kind of somewhat common practice over the last few decades. And the U.S. Department of War is doing something similar here. Okay, that is one thing happening. In tandem with that, there's also the fact that Nicolas Maduro, who's the sort of president of Venezuela, is in charge, overseeing a kind of declining society, and his days appear to be numbered. And there's a long-term effort on the part of people inside the U.S. State Department. Marco Rubio, in particular, back in 2019, led a kind of effort with people like Mike Pence, Pompeo, Bolton was a part of this crew, who attempted to depose Maduro in favor of this guy named Juan Guaido, I believe was the guy's name. And even at one point in 2019, people may forget this now, the U.S. actually recognized Guaido as the president of Venezuela. Now, it's interesting that they ultimately backtracked on that and showed a kind of remarkable constraint. I thought back at the time we were headed towards another sort of regime change incident, which I was not a fan of, and I don't think I'd be a fan of in this case, but there are some nuances here that I want to discuss. In any case, there was remarkable restraint. Trump pulled back. Guaido came here, and then there was an election last year in Venezuela in which Maduro lost by like 40 points. He got killed by the opposition party, but he's still in power. So he's definitely is an illegitimate leader. Venezuela's a mess. This is causing problems for the United States, not just the drugs that are coming in, but also these refugees. Venezuelans were part of this CNVH group, the Cuban, Nicaraguan, Venezuelans, and Haitians that Mayorkas and Biden were bringing in illegally to resettle in the United States. And so this is having consequences. Maduro's ongoing control of Venezuela is having consequences, and Trump is trying to get him out of office. Trump actually told him in a phone call a month ago that if he leaves now, he'd find a safe haven somewhere, and they'd let him go. And there was this kind of implicit threat. If he doesn't leave, something's going to happen. And I think everybody's kind of waiting around for that something to happen, for the other shoe to drop. And this bombing, this sudden bombing of the narco boats, which has been ongoing for a couple months, I think fits in here somewhere. That is a kind of maybe a deterrent, or yes, exactly. They're demonstrating a show of force to indicate to Maduro that he needs to act in the interest of the United States here, or something more volatile might happen. So that's the very broad overview.
Yeah, look, Venezuela is a really interesting country because it was once seen as the land of opportunity for Europeans to immigrate to Venezuela, to make a life, to build a society, to gain wealth, to escape some of the sclerotic bureaucracy and, remnants of the feudal past in Europe. And actually, some of my relatives, some of my cousins immigrated to Venezuela in the post-war period from Italy. Interesting. And then they returned to Italy, 30, 40 years later in the early 2000s, after Hugo Chavez rose to power. Again, kind of the mentor of Nicolas Maduro, kind of communist, classical Latin American communist dictator. Yeah. And
Tank
what had
driver.
happened?
Very
they had made
macho guy,
They had made money in Venezuela. They had done well. They had built a life in Caracas. They were, Italian Venezuelans. But then they saw the writing on the wall through the 90s, and then they started seeing the very real possibility, which actually came to pass, that the Chavez regime was starting to just expropriate businesses. And sure enough, there was this constant threat of unfair taxation, a kind of mob-like treatment of their businesses, the seizure of their assets. And eventually they said, no, we're going back to Italy. And so my cousins are very interesting because, he's an Italian by blood, spoke Italian, in the home, but also was a, fluent Spanish speaker. And so it's this remigration because of the desperate situation of Venezuela. But from an American point of view, it's also interesting. I think there's a couple things happening. One is there's valid skepticism. anytime I hear an American political leader designate something like with a dash and then terrorism, I'm always a little suspicious. Like, wait a minute, why are they narco terrorists? Why aren't they just narco cartels or drug traffickers? You know, they're now terrorists so that we can drone strike them at will. Like, okay, that already raises my suspicions a little bit, saying, okay, what's really happening here? There is, of course, the Marco Rubio style anti-communist actions that the United States has been involved in for a very long time. On the other side, though, I'll make the positive case. I'm not even really sure I'm convinced by it, but we'll at least tease it out. The positive case is that America's regime change operations in Latin America have been on net historically much more successful and much more cost efficient than our regime change operations in the Middle East. And so bringing democracy to Afghanistan is a different thing than bringing a, right-wing leader to a Latin American country. We actually have done that with mixed success, but I think on net, fairly decent success. And so there is this sense that we shouldn't conflate our own hemisphere with another. We shouldn't conflate, the Americas with the Middle East, certainly. And Trump is maneuvering right now, and the Venezuelans are certainly weak economically. And so we'll see what's happening. But my suspicion is with you that right now we're in a period of provocation. And I would like to see a little bit more honest declaration of our intentions relative to Venezuela so the public can actually make a debate. Do we want to depose a leader of a Latin American country or not? And if we do, what's the plan, guys?
Yeah, okay. I think that's a perfectly legitimate point of view, although I'm going to push back in a few ways, and I want to actually pin you down on something. I don't want you to be quite so evasive here. With the narco boats, let's start there. Is that a justifiable action by our Department of War or not, in your view?
Again, I don't have actually a strong opinion about it. If you're talking about as a legal, technical matter, I don't know. I'm sure there are lawyers that can figure it out. But as a matter of foreign policy, look, international waters, drug traffickers, foreign enemies, in a sense, they're fair game. Like the international law, international law, international norms, the United Nations, all of that is fake. If we're in a state of war with another country, a state of war means that you're in a state of war. And certainly if it's legitimate to drone strike, if it's legally permissible or constitutionally permissible to drone strike, terrorists overseas in the Middle East, it's certainly the same standard should apply here. So I don't actually think, I'm not necessarily too troubled or even too skeptical of the legality of this effort related to American constitutional law. I think it's really a question of prudence. Not can we do it, but should we do it?
Is there a pragmatic benefit to it? Is the question I want to ask. Like,
I don't think so.
I'm kind of agnostic
so.
on the moral question.
I don't think there's a pragmatic benefit. And that's where I think the case for these strikes falls apart because, I remember I studied this as an undergraduate. I took a really good class from a great professor called Drugs in the Third World. Okay. And it was someone who had been involved at a very high level in kind of international government, international institutions, looking at interdiction, transportation, distribution of illegal drugs all over the world. And one of the key things I've always remembered now, 20 years later, is this idea of the balloon effect. When you squeeze a balloon and you restrict the supply in one country, it almost inevitably, like a kind of law of social science, balloons out and increases in another country. This is certainly true of cocaine. We know this through long experience. If you nuke the cocaine poppy field or cocaine coca fields in Colombia, it will get bigger in Bolivia or whatever. I can't remember the specific flow. So I think look. Drone striking narco boats is not about restricting the flow of drugs into the United States. It's not going to do anything, even marginally.
All right,
and so there is another motivation, and I think that's really the key here. I don't accept the kind of surface level case as what's really happening. I think it's a political and geostrategic provocation. But look, the suppression of drug supply internationally does not work. It has not worked, and I don't think it will work in the future.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe we're chasing like a sort of an impossible to corral problem here, which is the drug trade, and particularly the cocaine trade coming out of the northern part of South America. However, I'll just say, like, the argument for, and again, I'm not terribly interested, or at least kind of agnostic on the moral legal case here, is that this is a deterrent. Okay, if you are a guy who, whatever level you are in the hierarchy of the cartel, is irrelevant to me. First of all, because I see a lot of people saying, "Well, these are just like the mules taking this there." Well, too bad. Okay, you work inside of a cartel. There's going to be consequences. I'm sorry, not actually sorry here. And maybe the argument I would say is something like a broken windows policing kind of deterrent to drug running, which is if you have severe and swift consequences, or the potential for severe and swift consequences at every level of the chain, this is going to ultimately create a meaningful deterrent effect, and it might actually slow down the drug trade. Maybe not. I don't know.
I think that analogy doesn't work for a key reason. Broken windows policing is predicated on officers on the ground, tightly knitted into the community, building relationships at that street level, and then having an overwhelming and constant presence, in physical space. And so we cannot have that for legal reasons, geostrategic reasons, budgetary reasons. We can't do that. We can't have, 500,000 DEA agents spread out all over South America, and the pinpoint drone strike. It isn't that kind of thing. And the deterrent, yeah, of course, at the margins, there's some deterrent, but the economic incentives are this big. And on the other side of that, teeter-totter, you're putting in a disincentive that's this big. Again, it's just not going to move. It's like a tiny baby sitting on a teeter-totter trying to, knock over like Yao Ming on the other side. It's just, it's just not enough. And it's not, and so therefore I have to say it has to be something else.
Okay. And so I'll let you have the last word on that. I think, as now moving to the other possibility and likelihood, I think, which is that it's geostrategic provocation. This is about Maduro. This is about nudging him to get out of Venezuela. I'm of the mind here that I don't like the idea of regime change as a general matter. It tends not to work. Because the situation in a country is bad, and I'll grant that the situation in Venezuela is bad, does not therefore mean that us going in and inserting a more friendly leader is going to improve the situation long term, either for us or for the people in Venezuela. We've seen over and over again that particular mindset fail. However, I take your point that in South America, the results have been mixed and there have been a certain number of successes. And so perhaps it is the case that when you're dealing within your own sphere of influence, there is more ways to kind of put your thumb on the scale and nudge populations to do things and maneuver in ways that are more beneficial to you and integrate them into your economies so that, easy kinds of trade can open up that can more swiftly accelerate economic growth and make those populations more pleased with the new arrangement. So I take it that it's possible to do this. In the case of Maduro, this is what I'm sort of thinking through. When I look at this, I think this guy is kind of a doofus. Like, I didn't really realize how sort of silly he was until, watching some of these videos and looking through some of his scandals over the years. It's sort of remarkable that he's been in power for this long. I saw there was this video of him singing John Lennon's Imagine, for example.
Imagine us people.
It's like this very cringe, very kind of like hippy dippy communism, as opposed to the more like macho Chavez style, like strongman communism, which I don't like any better, but I have at least a sort of grudging respect for, I suppose. But Maduro is this very foolish character. I think he's exhausted his time as the leader of Venezuela. I think that's very clear just as an objective matter. There's no way he can stay in power for much longer. I think he knows that, and he's starting to entertain some of these offers to go move somewhere else and let someone else take charge. So the question is, okay, there can be a military coup. We could have someone who is underneath Maduro, maybe within his party, take control. There can be a kind of, maybe populist uprising of some kind. And there could possibly be like this, I think her name's Machado. She's the woman who won the Nobel Prize. She's sort of like the favorite of the international community, so to speak. And so, look, maybe one of these versions is better for us. And if we can conclude, and if we can say with some reasonable certainty that one of these versions is better for us, we're not introducing any additional risk. We're not going to put troops on the ground, certainly. We're not going to create any kind of, kinetic situation where there's fighting with guns. And we can just kind of nudge, put our thumb on the scale and put that person who's best for us in charge. I guess my feeling here is like, why not? What is the argument for not doing that?
I don't think there's a good one. I think the argument for not doing that is just the America First skepticism of intervention of any kind. And so I think it requires the administration to patiently explain why these are two different categories. Right. And to remind Americans that we have had kind of subtle, like soft coup, proxy wars, economic sanctions and economic, enticements that have shifted governments, and that this playbook is different than the idea that we're going to occupy a country and rebuild it from the bottom up. And so, I think, look, eventually, Maduro has to go. He's not good for Venezuela, and more importantly, he's not good for us. So I think it's a wait and see, and I hope that, again, there's obviously reasons to keep some of the true intentions covert, but I hope we do have a bit of a debate. So let's talk about the final story, and the final story is a New York Times investigation that involved, I think, 5 reporters over many months. And it was a smear piece against the entrepreneur, David Sachs, kind of conservative entrepreneur, friend of Peter Thiel, old kind of PayPal mafia, successful venture investor, who is now the president's AI czar. And, I like David. I'll put my cards on the table. I like David a lot. I helped David with some of the AI executive orders. A big fan of David's. And I read this smear piece with, going into it saying, this is almost certainly BS. I wasn't disappointed. I think it was totally BS. But walk us through what the Times was trying to do with this piece and where it succeeded or failed.
Okay, so this hit Twitter, I think, on Monday or so, early in the week. And this is obviously an attempt to damage the reputation of David Sachs. That's one piece of it, but I think he's just a kind of unfortunate target here, but the aims are larger. Their intentions are larger. Having read the piece, one thing that struck me was that there is absolutely nothing there. I was actually surprised how impotent it was. It was just, there was no there. I was reminded of the great seminal millennial movie Billy Madison. There's a scene where the tycoon, the hotel tycoon, sends the janitor to go dig up dirt on Adam Sandler's character Billy Madison, and he comes back and all he can report on, he says that Billy likes to drink soda. And Miss Lippy's car is green. Okay, it's like these, there's no payoff to any of this. There's nothing that comes to this. So then I go, okay, well, what is the point of this? And what I think is actually happening here and is kind of subtly hinted at in the piece, they quote Bannon at one point, Steve Bannon, and Steve Bannon has been a critic of the sort of tech right and what he calls the sort of tech oligarchy. He's been very suspicious of the motivations of people like David Sachs and Elon Musk, of course, to sort of support Trump, and why are they doing this, and what do they want out of this, and do they really have the American people's interests at heart, or are they just trying to sort of manipulate the moment for some reason? And I think there is a real tension in this emerging coalition between this sort of tech faction and a more sort of populist faction. And I don't actually think, and reading, I've followed David Sachs and I've paid attention to the things he said over the years. I don't think there's actually a very meaningful tension between David Sachs specifically and the kinds of things that like Steve Bannon wants to accomplish. If you take David Sachs at his word, he wants American technology to dominate the world. He wants an American AI stack, from top to bottom, to be what's used as a sort of global standard, and that includes beating China. And so I think his efforts are sincere. They seem perfectly, I don't know the ins and outs of the debate around this and whether it's a good idea to have our chips being sold to China. I have to be sort of agnostic about that, but I don't see here any like malicious or shady intent. I have no reason to believe these guys have anything but the interests of American market dominance in mind. But what the New York Times wants to do is widen the fissure between these tech people and the more populist wing of the right, and introduce or at least amplify what might be a kind of native skepticism, and give people like Steve Bannon an opportunity to say, see, I told you so. And so even if the evidence isn't there, people who have it out for the tech people anyway can still point to this article. Who's going to actually read it? Very few people. And say, look, these guys have bad intentions. They are taking advantage of Trump. They are using this to line their pockets and make their friends rich. And they only have their own companies in mind. And if it comes down to it, they're going to, bail out the AI companies, and damage the economic prospects of everybody else in this coalition. I find that to be all very specious, but I think this New York Times article is attempting to serve that purpose.
Yeah, I see it. It's similar in one way, but a little bit differently in another way. I think the underlying purpose isn't so much to drive a wedge on the right, although there may be some of that happens. I think the actual primary purpose is to send a signal to people in other industries that if you become a kind of out conservative, if you work with the Trump administration, if you try to put yourself into the political arena, we're going to smear you in the organ of public opinion that your colleagues and your community takes as the truth. And we can write a headline, and this is the headline: Silicon Valley's man in the White House is benefiting himself and his friends. Right. They're accusing him of corruption. And then you actually read, you're like, all right, well, can they prove it? And it's like, well, he's divested 99% of his assets. He's done all the ethics waivers. He's done all of the, it's like basically he's done everything possible to avoid not just corruption, but even the appearance of corruption. But the message is, we're not going to prove the case, but we're going to smear you to then deter people in finance, in technology, in academia, and in other kind of elite sectors. And look, this stuff actually works. I don't think it works like it did in the past, but I think it certainly makes people like, for example, Fortune 100 CEOs a little bit hesitant, and and so it works at the margins. It's losing power, and I can say this, having gotten to know David over the last few years. He is absolutely genuine. And the funny thing is, actually, the billionaires in Trump's cabinet are losing money by taking time out of their career to serve in public. Like David is almost certainly losing money, or at least as a matter of opportunity cost, not making as much money as he could.
Right.
If he were to just say, I'm going to sit in the private sector, I'm going to invest, I'm going to ride the AI boom, like he's actually doing it because he cares. And the comparison here is the left wants just like NGO, academic, people who like need the salary of the government job, that have no accomplishments, no independent base of power. Whereas actually we want people like David working in politics. We want people that are highly competent, that understand the industry, that understand how to manage large organizations. They understand how finance works. So David is great. He's taking the hits on our behalf as the American people. And I think this was a big swing and a miss from the New York Times.
Actually, I think maybe I'm being willfully naive here. I don't think it works at all anymore. I grant you that this worked in 2016 and throughout Trump's first term. And there were a lot of people, just by virtue of working in Trump's administration, who suffered from sort of career reputational risk. Okay. People were not able to get jobs. People at white shoe law firms. If you were like in Trump's DOJ, that makes that kind of thing very hard to come by once you're out. So that was a real thing. Maybe it's real to some extent still, but my view of it is like, I think the New York Times is doing us a favor in some sense. This is, I think, hardening the resolve of someone like David Sachs and other conservative or Trump-friendly tech leaders who see this thing and go, okay, yeah, these people have zero interest in even trying to bring us back into the liberal fold. Even if we wanted to, they're not letting us back in the tent. And so, one, we don't want to, because the left, the establishment, still is suffering from all the same kind of pathologies that they were previously suffering from and haven't shown any indication to have learned any of the lessons of the last, decade. So that's one. And then two, even if we wanted to, we're not welcome. So we're just going to hang out with our friends on the right from now on. And maybe I'm being willfully naive, maybe. And I'm kind of speaking against what I said earlier, that this is like opening up a fissure on the right. But to the extent that we can build bridges across those differences, and, we can get like the Bannon wing to make at least some kind of temporary peace with the tech wing, that actually does in the end make the coalition stronger. So anyway, this is all just to say that this is a complete nothing. I wonder too, Chris, we started the hour talking about how you turn a kind of investigative journalism into something, into action, into meaningful consequence. I think the New York Times, I don't want to get a little over my skis here, but maybe are losing the ability to do that. I think a story like this was supposed to, get the White House in a frenzy so that Susie Wiles or Trump has to like do something and, maybe make a statement and maybe even remove David Sachs from his position.
Yep.
But it doesn't do any of that. I mean, we're talking about it, okay, but we're talking about it in the context that it's a nothing burger, that it's not going to go anywhere or have any lasting impact that's to the benefit of the people who wrote the story. So I guess, is the New York Times in some sense losing the power to do the thing that you did, for example, with the Somali fraud story?
Yes, and for two reasons. I mean, the first reason is just the most obvious, but maybe one that's easy to forget, is that you actually have to deliver the goods.
Yeah.
And so, yes, if this were true, and they had the evidence and they delivered the goods and it was a spectacular scoop, I think it still could have had some power. The fact is that they just didn't get there. They had the headline that was pre-written, and then they never substantiated it in the piece. But there is also a marginal degradation of the prestige power of publications like the New York Times, which have run these cycles so many times that they're losing energy, they're losing authority with each turn of the wheel. And in 5 years ago, 10 years ago, if the New York Times had a nasty headline about you, it was a big problem for you. But the right has we've learned how to protect our own and how to not react to the Times. And then through the boy who cried wolf phenomenon, all of this hyper hysteria that had come out of the New York Times for such a long period has degraded their ability to make these things stick. And so, look, the New York Times is still the most prestigious American newspaper. That's just a fact, whether we like it or not. But in relative terms to the past, it just doesn't have as much juice or power or stickiness as it once did. And that is a good thing. And I think it is, and I'm going to go ahead and take credit, fantastic comparison that you teed up. Our reporting in City Journal had much more power than the New York Times reporting on David Sacks. And so we have opportunities. We should not despair. The right is building. And as long as we are doing the work, getting the goods, and playing the game in a sophisticated way, I think things are looking up and up. And I'll give you the last word.
All right. Well, speaking of doing the work, dear listener, please do the work of liking and subscribing on Apple iTunes, 5 stars. Please comment. Our handlers are insisting we remind you of that, so please do so. But I think that's everything for this week. So good to see you, and we'll have more next week.
Until next time.